Title: The Abounding Grace of God. Text: Ephesians 4:8, Introduction. The testimony of Scripture declares that God is not merely gracious in action, but that he is, in his very nature, the God of grace. Grace is not an occasional attribute. It is the very atmosphere of his dealings with humanity. From beginning to end, the story of redemption reveals a God who gives freely, acts decisively, and completes fully what he has purposed. The source of grace, the heart of God. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us. Ephesians 2:4. Grace originates not in man's need, but in God's character. It flows from his richness in mercy and the greatness of his love. Before any human response, before any work or effort, grace was already moving. This grace is not reluctant. It is abundant. It is not measured in small portions, but poured out in fullness. The initiative is entirely divine. God acts because he is love, not because man earns his favor. The power of grace, from death to life, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together. Ephesians 2:5. Grace does not assist the weak, it raises the dead. Humanity is described not as struggling, but as lifeless in trespasses. Grace, therefore, is not cooperative, it is resurrecting. Where there was separation, grace brought union. Where there was death, grace brought life. This transformation is not gradual improvement, but a decisive act, God making alive those who were dead. This reveals that grace is not dependent on human strength. It operates in the absence of it. The accomplishment of grace, a finished work, and raised us up together and made us sit together. Ephesians 2:6. Grace does not begin a work it intends to leave unfinished. It completes what it starts. The language here is not future hope, but accomplished reality, raised, seated, established. This speaks of a completed redemption. The work of God has brought his people into a position of rest, not striving. What grace accomplishes, it secures fully. There is no uncertainty in grace. It does not depend on fluctuating human performance, but rests on the unchanging work of God. The measure of grace, exceeding riches, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace. Ephesians 2:7. Grace is described as exceeding, beyond measure, beyond limitation. It cannot be exhausted, and it cannot be diminished. God's intention is to display this grace continually. It is not a temporary provision, but an eternal revelation of his kindness. This means that grace is not only sufficient, it is overflowing. It surpasses sin, surpasses failure, and surpasses every limitation of man. The reception of grace. By faith, not works. For by grace you have been saved through faith, not of works. Ephesians 2:8-9. Grace excludes boasting because it excludes earning. It is received, not achieved. Faith is not a work that earns grace. It is the empty hand that receives what God has already given. The emphasis remains on God's action, not man's effort. This establishes a foundation of rest. If grace is not based on works, it is not sustained by them either. Conclusion. The doctrine of God's grace reveals a salvation that begins with God, is accomplished by God, and is secured by God. It is rooted in his love, demonstrated in his power, completed in his work, and displayed in its abundance. Grace is not partial. It is not uncertain. It is not dependent. It is the full, finished, and overflowing expression of God's heart toward his people. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace.